Hello, welcome to the keynote address for the Humanities Podcasting Symposium. My name is Kim Adams. I am one of the founding members of the Humanities Podcast Network, and I'm really excited to be giving this introduction. So let us begin. So in 2018, I received an email that began, "Hello, you don't know me. I'm a public radio reporter and part-time historian of medicine." The email went on to describe an archival research trip to the Waring Historical Library at the University of South Carolina Medical School. It was the kind of email that doesn't have capital letters at the start of sentences and lots of lowercase i's like an E.E. Cummings poem. The archive in question had contained this bizarro little 19th century doohickey called an earthquake ray battery, which was one of many quack medical devices of the era that promised to harness the curative power of electricity to treat all manner of ailments. This one supposedly charged up electricity from earthquakes and then applied it to the patient through a bracelet on their wrist. The part-time historian of medicine had read a description of my PhD project in a newsletter from the NYU Humanities Center and thought I might be interested to visit the archive and see the device, which, according to the curator, was probably the only one of its kind that still exists on Earth. This is not the kind of email that graduate students are accustomed to receiving. I sent a pleasant enough reply expressing my astonishment about the earthquake ray battery and recommending one of my favorite books about historical medical devices. How curious, I thought, that somebody else is interested in this topic. And I thought nothing more of the email until a few weeks ago when I searched my email archive for Latif Nasser. I was expecting to find some planning documents for this conference and perhaps the lovely poster that Saronik designed or an email from John with the timeline for our keynote. But instead, I found this curious, inquisitive public radio reporter who had taken the time to read a dissertation abstract of someone he had never met and recommend an archive that might be of use in their project. While I have yet to visit the Waring Historical Library and witness the earthquake ray battery, I am pleased to introduce Latif Nasser as the keynote speaker for the Humanities Podcasting Symposium. He completed a PhD in 2014 in the History of Science department at Harvard University, where he wrote his dissertation on the Tanganyika laughter epidemic of 1962. He lives in Los Angeles, where he works as a co-host for the NPR show Radiolab. In 2020, he produced a documentary series on Netflix called Connected, with episodes on the science of everything, from clouds to excrement. And recently, he hosted a podcast miniseries with Radiolab called The Other Latif, about a Guantanamo Bay detainee who happens to share his name. Latif Nasser will be speaking with John Plotz, a founding member of the Humanities Podcast Network. John is a professor of English at Brandeis University who writes about Victorian novels and science fiction. He co-hosts the podcast Novel Dialogue and Recall This Book. The keynote address itself will take the form of a podcast, roughly. John and Latif will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. We ask that you put your questions in the Q&A box to help out our moderators. Thank you so much.
Kim, thank you. And Latif, thank you. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. That was such a great introduction.
Totally.
I was like listening about that. That email was such a long time ago, but I was trying to remember it. But I was like, oh, at the beginning when you didn't say that it was me, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I
know.
I should look into that. And I was like, oh, maybe I already did. Anyway, but
I feel like we should now report that this broadcast is being powered by the earthquake battery. So I just want to pick up on one thing that Kim said in that great introduction, which is that this is the Humanities Podcast Network. And I think a lot of you folks here today are actually part of the symposium. So welcome. We're going to have a chance to talk a lot more. But if you're tuning in and you're not a part of the symposium, I just want to give you a chance to join a mailing list for the network, because it's a new thing. I mean, when Kim said I'm a founding member, I mean, we all founded it together 4 months ago. So it's really fun to see this come to fruition with this wonderful conversation. Can
I also jump in and say one thing, not to step on you in any way, but yeah. Like for me, I feel like when I was a grad student, such a thing existing, like it seems so like science fiction in a way, in a way where podcasts were when I was a grad student, to where they are now, like winning Pulitzer Prizes and influencing Supreme Court cases and stuff. It just seems like the medium has gone so far, and this feels like a very natural place for it. But imagining myself back then like this, I was like, wow, if there was such a thing, I would have been so excited. Well, anyway,
that's great. I mean, you're not stepping on anything, because that's kind of my pushing off question, was what I think of as the Admiral Stockdale question, which is like, who am I and what am I doing here? So can I just ask you a little bit about that arc, how transitioning from academia and history of science to this very public facing career that you have?
Yeah, I was in that history of science graduate program, and I was in it. To be totally honest, I got in it because I didn't know what else to do, and I graduated college in 2008, and there was the economic crash, and I was like, I had like a theater degree basically, and I was like, I don't know how I'm gonna make money or what I'm gonna do. So I kind of went to grad school in a way just to be like, okay, let me do something interesting to sort of pass some time before I figure out what I really want to do. And I really fell in love with the field, history of science. I learned so much. I thought it was so interesting, and I kept finding all these stories all around me that that I was like, how does everybody not know this? This is so interesting. And I love thinking about this stuff. And so it was around that time when I first started there that I first heard a podcast, which was Radiolab, was maybe the first or second podcast I ever heard. And
oh, wow.
Yeah. And I think at the time, like, I don't think anybody I knew had heard a podcast before or had heard of podcasts before. And I heard it and I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I wasn't really drawn, I'll be honest, I wasn't really drawn to the form so much. I was drawn to the tone. I really loved the tone of the show. It was like, it was doing the stuff that I felt like I was doing as an academic. Like, it was like doing original research. It was doing, but it had this kind of like emotional, it felt like it was funny. It was sad. It was scored. It was beautiful. And I was like, wow, this is I feel like this is good. And I also feel like I have stories that you could do this for. Anyway, so I got interested in that way. And then at some point I was working on my dissertation, and I realized, actually, this is how I first heard that Radiolab episode. I was working on my dissertation, and Radiolab had done an episode about this very obscure thing I was writing my dissertation on. And so I listened to it. The laughter epidemic. Exactly. Yeah. And I listened to it and I was like, oh, this is surprisingly good. And so I called up the producer of that episode. She was the executive producer of the show. And I was like, oh, great. And I just wanted to learn more about, the behind the scenes of making that segment and what tape. I was like, can you just give me all your tape that what's on your cutting room floor? And then also at the end of that call, I was like, oh, and by the way, I have a bunch of other story ideas. And I didn't know what else to I didn't know what I imagined would happen next, but I was like, here, you got to do these stories. And she actually on the phone, she rejected all of the ideas. She was like, nah, we're not going to do that. And there was like, there's gotta be like 10 ideas or something that I gave her. And she's like, nah, that's not for us. Nah, not quite. But at the same time, she was like, these are really original. Like, I've never heard these pitches before. And why don't you keep sending us ideas? And so that's kind of how it started. I started doing that. And I kind of put more and more effort into thinking about like what stories I would sort of pitch them, and then they would reject them, and then I would say, oh, but I still think this is really interesting. And then so I'd kind of try to go other places and try to pitch them there. And one professor of mine at the time, Jill Lepore, she connected me with someone at the Boston Globe. So then I basically then kind of started kind of winging it, a journalistic career. Like I was sort of freelancing on the side while I was a grad student, writing up these things that I was excited about, that I was like, people should know about this. This is so interesting. And then from there, I basically just kept pitching Radiolab until they did one of my stories, and then another, and then another. And then I ended up just hanging out there. I would especially while I was writing my dissertation, it was such a sort of a lonely task writing the dissertation, that they invited me regularly to their like Friday pitch meetings, Radiolab did. And that would be the highlight of my week, just because I was, around all these interesting people with all these interesting stories. And it was a kind of break from the single-mindedness and the loneliness of my dissertation. And then ultimately I just was there so often that they were like, hey, do you want to work here? Like, you don't already? What do you want to work here? So then that's kind of how I got my first job there. And my first job was actually, it was sort of half the job was being a producer and half the job was being a fact checker. Yeah. And then I kind of worked my way up through there. And basically after I graduated, that then became my full-time job. And along the way, I was sort of freelancing with a bunch of other outlets, including some of my early Radiolab stories then led to my getting an opportunity to do a TED Talk, and then another TED Talk, and then those opportunities basically kind of led to the Netflix, this production company coming up to me saying, we want to do something with you, and then we pitched stuff, including to Netflix, and then they wanted to make it. So so that's kind of the how the A connects to the B.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So that connects a couple. So we actually crowdsourced the network crowdsourced some question writing here. And what you said connects to a couple of different ones. So I'm going to try to ask you a question that sort of connects them. So One question is, there's a sort of general question, how you use your PhD skills in the podcasting work you do. But we also asked the question of the difference between, researching or creating an episode of Radiolab versus something like researching an academic article. And I guess the one point I wanted to pull on from what you just said was to think about that question of like the loneliness of the academy, because there's lots of ways in which being an academic isn't lonely. I mean, you watch an episode of The Chair and it doesn't seem that lonely. It feels crowded, but that archival side can be lonely. So you're describing a kind of warmth of engagement, not what's visible publicly, but behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay. So I feel like there are three questions.
There's three questions.
Really interesting, but let me take the first one first, which is the kind of what of my PhD do I use regularly? I really do think I do, and not sort of the obvious things in that. And I should say this at the front, I expected, and maybe this is naive of me, I don't know. I expected I would have this PhD and I would be out in the world. And then if anybody mentioned anything related to what I wrote my PhD about, like in a pitch meeting, say, or something, everybody would just be quiet and look at me to be like, oh, you wrote a PhD about this. What do you think? But nobody actually cares. Nobody has ever deferred to my expertise or anything. My PhD, it's funny. I thought it would matter way more than it did, but there were a lot of things from getting that PhD that have served me and continue to serve me. So one of them, I think, is just research skills. Man, the ability to kind of push past, first of all, do a broad survey of a topic or a question, synthesize that information very quickly, realize, wait a second, all of these people, they're all kind of saying the same three things, but actually the question that I have, I think I can push past and do some original work here. That is a really, really great skill, I think, that I picked up, and I wouldn't have picked up if I had not gone to grad school. Another one is there was something that one of my professors, Alan Brandt, once told me, where he was like, he was like, basically you can make an argument with a story tucked in it. No, you can make a story with an argument tucked in it, or you can make an argument with a story tucked in it, basically. And I realized what I was doing in grad school, so much of it was argument writing with stories tucked in it. And then so much of what I was doing at Radiolab was stories with arguments tucked in them. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, and that was also something I realized from taking a class with Jill Lepore, that I was like, oh, like a lot of these skills actually of making an argument, those are actually transferable skills. So I think research, and then also like writing, persuasive writing, argumentative writing, and to some degree story writing, but mostly kind of the argument side. I think all of those from my PhD, kind of have transferred. So that was the first question. The second question was, how is it different making kind of a Radiolab episode than an academic paper, let's say. I do think there are a lot of similarities in the sense that you're trying to do something original. You're trying to survey everything people said and then push past it. You are also trying to, you're trying to give credit. You're trying to show your sources, show your work. Those are all very similar. I think one thing, it's funny, it's sort of the order of operations in a way. So if I was writing an academic paper, like what you do is like you first kind of hit the books. It's like, what has everybody said about this thing? Whereas as a podcast journalist, like I feel like what I do is I first go to the people, and I go to the people and I go purposefully dumb to the people, so that, because I need it on tape, I need them to talk to me and I need them to tell me the story, and I need to be the ambassador for the listener who doesn't know anything. So I learn sort of fresh, and I let my questions and my reactions show that I am learning this fresh. And then after, on the backside, I'll sort of hit the books. Whereas I feel like often when I was doing academic work, I would read everything first, and then I'd go on the field trip, and then I'd talk to the people, the primary source actors who I was talking about. But in this case, it's sort of you flip the order. That's kind of one big difference, I think.
And then there was the sort of loneliness versus warmth of a team question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's definitely so at different times. Like the dissertation, like yes, you're totally right. Like teaching for me, I remember like in grad school, like being a teaching assistant, or going to a conference and like organizing like a panel with a bunch of people. Like there is a lot of stuff like that is very collaborative. That's very social. But for me, the dissertation was like it. And partly because so many of my sources were kind of archival sources, like it did feel like being a monk in a monastery, where you're like, well, I'm just all alone here, and the kind of the stuff that I'm doing all day, like I can't really talk to anybody about it. I feel like whereas and in a way, like to some degree, especially more recently when I've been doing like longer deep dives for Radiolab, it kind of actually weirdly feels the same thing, except you just maybe have you and a producer instead. But yeah, to me that was actually that was a surprisingly big part of what I was sort of craving, and I got from Radiolab and sort of podcast journalism in general. Like it's very collaborative, and TV is even more so. Like it's very much a team sport. Like everything is a team sport. Yeah.
So this is a sort of a tricky question to ask, but it came up a couple of times in the panels I've already been to this morning, like the theory one, which is about the process of I don't know if the right phrase for this is something like the performed intimacy or the collaborative liveliness that comes out, like the end product has this warmth, which, I'm sure that comes out of a genuine warmth. You can tell that you guys like each other and all that, but it's also part of the thing that podcasts deliver. And the question is kind of about the relationship between the back end collaboration and then the performing of it that makes the show. Yeah.
We do a thing at Radiolab, and I think a lot of shows do this now, although I think Radiolab was one of the first to do it long before I got there, so instead of writing narration for the episode, what we do is the reporter goes out, reports the whole story, talks to all the sources, and then we call it a brain dump. So what you do is you sit down with the host who doesn't know anything about the story, and you tell them the story. So, and the host is your friend, and you tell them the story as if you were in a diner and you were just telling them this crazy story that you, and so that kind of like it, in a way, it's the connection between the backstage warmth and friendliness, and it's trying to bring that warmth on stage, and I think that to me, like there is sometimes it's sort of feigned, like when it's like when we have a funny, back and forth, and then it makes it in the piece, and then we fact check it, and we're like, oh, it was all based on it. And so you have to kind of recreate it in a weird, awkward, fake way. But often it's not. Like often it really is. It is a kind of and I do think that it's part of it. Like it's funny to me that like my relationship with my host and or my editor, it's like in a way it's like out there for everybody to see. Whereas if I was writing in a newspaper or even an academic journal, like none of that is apparent or clear or straightforward. And not to say that it's a it's a perfectly accurate, faithful representation of all the battles we have over, oh, I want this thing in here and this thing, whatever. But it is interesting that it's sort of something about this medium where that putting that kind of out, it makes the end product more appealing, more alluring, and feels more authentic in a way.
Yeah. So another thing that a panelist said, Sarah Dugan is her name, I believe, in the panel about audiences last hour, she said she thinks about having like a performed version of herself on her podcast, like not a mask. She said specifically not a mask, but a kind of theatricality, I guess. Can you comment
I think
on
that's
that?
True. I think that's true. I think that's true. It's funny, like I feel like there's an arc of that. Like I feel like especially when you first start and when you first are recording your voice and you're hearing your voice and you're like, oh my God, I hate the sound of my voice. And then you try to be, like Ira Glass or something, or I don't know who, like Terry Gross, or I don't know who you're trying to be. But you're trying to be someone else. And then ultimately, then you hear that, and then you're like, "Oh God, that's even worse somehow." But it does take a while to sort of find your own groove, find your own voice. But even then, I do think that there is partly a performance about it. And for me, in a way, because by the times we're doing those brain dumps, also like the story's not a given. Like I'm in selling mode because I want to sell this story. Like I want us to do this story, and it takes the whole kind of consensus of the editorial team to want to do it. So I'm kind of like and
that's what's being recorded. Like in other words, the moment that is recorded that eventually makes it on air has that element where you're trying to persuade people in the team.
Sometimes it's different in different cases, but sometimes, and we do fact check it and stuff, so it's not like puffery salesmanship kind of thing. But it is that a little bit. But in a way, it's funny because it's channeling that feeling like you're at a dinner party with your friends, and you do that same thing. I mean, at least I do at a dinner party with my friends, where you're like, no, but this story is so crazy. Like, and that's that, so it's that feeling. And it is true that it's kind of it is a heightened version. And at times it is a performance. Like for example, this is also true in my TV show, like where like, in order for me and a team of camera people and to fly halfway across the world to interview somebody, to like, I need to know what they're going to say ahead of time. Like I need to know what the surprising thing is that they're going to say. But I also know that when I read that first story, or when I first discovered that story, that was really surprising to me. But then when I am in the interview with them, and I like, and maybe I would have forgotten part of what they were going to say, and so it is genuinely surprising, or I'm just trying to sort of channel the surprise that I initially had. But so there is a performative element of it, and sometimes it's a sort of exaggerated version of yourself. Sometimes it's a time traveled version of like, oh, this is the surprise I felt when I first learned this, even though now it's much later. Or sometimes it's I think the audience is going to be completely have their mind blown by that. So sometimes you're like trying to be a proxy for the audience, but yeah, but there is definitely a performance part of it that like, and it's a funny thing because sometimes you strip away that performance and it feels more authentic, and that's actually what you're going for. But then sometimes you feel like you want to punch a point or highlight a point or something, so then you kind of lay it on thick. I don't know. It's a very, and I feel like as a literary scholar, you probably can parse this stuff much better than I can.
I know, but yeah, I mean, and any thoughts about that question about how much that depends on the sort of the back and forth you're having with other people versus just putting it forth? I mean, like, in other words, there's a way that you perform and you're just thinking of public generically versus like, you know, you and Lulu, I'm imagining, know each other really well. So is it, and I do think when people talk about podcasts, part of what they respond to is that, I mean, the notion of words that come up specifically between two people, you know?
And it is a funny, very, like, I do feel like that's a specific podcasty kind of a thing, that sort of rapport being a kind of a driving, like a, I don't know, it almost feels like the, like in, what's it called? Mystery Science Theater 3000. Like
I think about that all the time.
Yeah. And it is kind of, I think it is kind of like that. And there's something that is appealing about that, and especially for a show like Radiolab, which like any given week, it's about a totally different thing, to have like some kind of familiar voice, sort of, like, yeah, you're sitting on the couch next to your friends, kind of a feeling, and you can hear them and you can hear that rapport, and you know that that's real, and so that somehow transmutes to, oh, and I know that they're not trying to and whether that's true or not in the case of other podcasts, but like I know they're not trying to manipulate me, or like I know they're good faith actors trying to trying to tell a faithful story, you know?
Yeah. Okay. So speaking of good faith actors, I kind of wanted to pivot. I mentioned this a little bit to you before, right before we started talking, that I heard a really interesting intervention this morning by a woman named, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Michelle Chihara, I think. So she's been working on basically social media architecture, like the kind of capitalist structure within which podcasts live and breathe. And obviously you're very lucky because you work for a not for-profit, but that doesn't exempt it from being
it doesn't at all
architecture.
I read the same ads as everybody where I'm, selling the electric toothbrushes and stuff. So I feel it. Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you think about that? Because I mean, you're, rightly emphasizing the kind of genuineness of the, the rapport and the warmth and the excitement, which we as, like that scholarly feeling of excitement of discovering a topic, but you were also aware of this as a, a podcast that has to rise or fall, that needs to have listeners and,
it has been an interesting, like, especially since I came in from academia, where I thought of everything's as like, I don't know, these like idea packages, that like we're like transmitting and sharing among like collegial scholars, like that kind of thing. Like, and it's like, oh no, this is a product. And in fact, this is also like in one way, because it's public radio, it's like a public product. It's like a public good. It's like a utility. But there's another way in which, for our podcast, like it's a luxury good. Like it's very expensive to make. It's very difficult to make. It's very time consuming to make. It's very, like labor intensive, cost intensive, time intensive. It's all of those things. So it is a luxury good that we're giving out. That all makes me, I don't know. At first I was like, oh, I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be a cog in this bigger, and especially like in recent months and years, like all these like power moves of these giant companies buying up, these behemoths buying up podcasts and different, all these things. And just, I'm like, I don't want anything to do with that. But I do feel like, to me, that realization, I'm making a luxury good in a way, but it's a luxury good that's available for free, but it's a luxury good. It makes me feel like I have this immense responsibility. the responsibility that I already had to be a good faith actor and to like, I don't want to poison the well of scholarly discourse and like, and insert, arguments that are factually wrong or are, but now it's like, no, this is like, in a way, it's like the public well. And I really don't, I don't know. For me, I feel like it is true that I'm making all these things, but because I have the luxury of being the one to make them, I don't know, I take that as a responsibility, and especially again, talking to the thing you were saying earlier, like even the kind of social media architecture that this exists within and is shared within and things like that, and how fake news, and I've done stories about this very thing, like fake news spreads so rapidly. It's so I don't know. I feel like I feel, and I know a lot of my team feels like a tremendous responsibility to do our best and do our damnedest and try to make, try to make quality stuff that like deserves this much, that merits the work that goes into it in a way.
Yeah. So maybe that's actually a good pivot to think about the question of podcasts within academia, like to that point about sort of fact checking and answerability. And so here's one way of thinking about it, that the network was inspired by sort of three different things. The idea of thinking about scholars and academics and research being a podcast potentially being an outgrowth of that. And we were inspired by the notion that podcasts might live as a kind of instructional medium within academia. And we're also inspired, especially like folks like Beth Kramer, who's here today, by thinking about what it means to teach students how to make podcasts. So those feel like three different ways of thinking about the podcast.
Yeah.
And, I mean, not to put you on the spot, you don't have to vote, but I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts about, like, should we be teaching our students with podcasts, or should we be teaching our students to make podcasts?
I think both. I mean, I think that sorry to cut.
Yeah, I mean,
question.
It was an unanswerable question.
Okay, yeah. No, but I do think both. Like, I think that it's a great way to, for me at least, it like has helped crystallize and solidify my thinking. I do think that often there's something about, like, I think of, and this actually answers one of the other questions I feel like I saw earlier, like, it's like, how do all these mediums differ, right? And so podcasting, I think, differing from writing, differing from TV, even theater and lectures, I guess you could call as a form of theater. Like if you put them all on a continuum, it's like the amount of agency and control that the audience member has, and I feel like writing, like the audience member has a lot of agency. Like they can stop and they can follow a footnote and they can go back and they can control the pace and they can. And then if you go one notch less control, it's like, I think podcasts are sort of less control of the audience, but more control of the maker, where you're kind of holding hands a little bit more. It's like, okay, I'm controlling the pace. I'm going to tell you the voices. You're going to hear these people's actual voices. And then to me, it goes all the way. Then a lecture is maybe even more than that, because you're controlling what they see in addition to what they hear. And then a TV is like the most like dictatorial control, where it's like, here, look at this. No, now look at this. Now listen to this. Now look at this. Yeah. And to me, I think I think podcasts are kind of a good way to kind of like especially early on when you're getting exposure to a topic that maybe you've never heard of before. Like it's a little bit more of a handholdy way to kind of help someone in, as opposed to say, oh, here's a stack of reading, which is great, and maybe they want to do that stack of reading, but it's like it can feel at times like I can imagine being an undergrad and being like, oh my, what are all these things? And there are all these footnotes. Where do I go? What do I look at? Like, I think a podcast is I don't know, it can be a sort of a gentler way in. And I think that there's something, I find them to be kind of inviting. They also have problems, like you can't footnote in a podcast. That's an issue. But I do think, I don't know, I think that it can be a very inviting way to kind of be introduced to a topic, especially.
Wait, Latif, can I follow up on that you can't footnote idea? Because that's been something I've been thinking about lately, about whether podcasts are defined by the fact that they live on, Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever, versus they're having a home with show notes. So for me, like the way we have a very nerdy podcast, our show notes are definitely footnotes. They're like do you not, but you don't think of that as an important aspect?
No,
you feel like that's just tiny, or
I do. No, I think that's important, but I also realize that and maybe it's for our show also, some people are listening on the radio. It's also like people tend to, I feel like the market research we hear about, it's like people are listening while they're doing their dishes. People are listening while they're like people aren't sort of sitting and reading the same way they would read a paper. So, but I don't mean to sort of trivialize that. Like, I think show notes and footnotes are vital and are good and are a kind of a badge you should wear proudly to say, look, like I have receipts in a way. But I do think that it doesn't feel like an integral part of the consumption of it. And like if you really desperately want people to see the footnotes, like a podcast isn't the best way to do that,
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So variation on this.
Sure.
Let's imagine you were invited to teach a class to students to make a podcast. And I'm not asking you to invent a syllabus, but what would the most important thing be to you? Like what would you start that class with?
I think I think so many people, when they think about that, when they start approaching that, the questions are often it's like, what kind of mic should I use? What kind of editing program should I use? What kind of, they're very technical questions. Yeah. And I actually, and maybe this is just to my bias, I don't know a lot of the answers to those technical questions. I know what we do at Radiolab, but I don't know, just technical wise, I'm not the best podcast person.
Your mic looks really nice, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. But to me, actually, to me, it's all about, maybe again, things that you would think about equally when you're looking, you're like, I want to write a book or something. Like, it's like, how are you framing this? How are you packaging this? What is the structure of it? What is the, who are the voices? What is the kind of even the traditional narrative? Like, is it narrative? Is it an argument? Is it a chat show? Is it an interview show? Is it there are a lot of different kinds of, there's almost like a taxonomy of, these are the general types of shows, and what kind of show do you want to make? And what is the, kind of what are the traditional hallmarks of that genre, I guess? Yeah. And how do you make something that feels like it, it could twist that genre, or it could add to that genre, or it could sort of contribute something, using that form, that would be, vital and sort of constructive in a world where we have a sort of a glut of podcasts, more than anyone could possibly ever listen to in their entire lifetime. But I do think so anyway, I hope that's enough of an answer to the question, but I do think it's I would not teach the technical stuff. There are great resources out there like transom.org, and there are other really, really terrific resources for the technical stuff. But if I had a bunch of students in a room, that's the stuff I would want to be talking about. Is the stuff I like thinking about is the form and the and genre, and what do you want to say, and what do you want to do, and what do you want to contribute in a way, and let's find the right container for that. Yeah.
That's great. So I see that we've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A queue, Latif. So I think I'm going to mute myself and hand it over to various other members of the network who are going to pass on some of the audience questions.
Awesome. Thanks, John. These have been great questions.
Cool. Great. I'll be back at the end.
Hey, Latif. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Pleasure.
So we have a question from Shrikant, and who asks, do you remember the number of pitches of yours that were rejected for Radiolab before your first pitch was accepted, and any pitch you really rooted for and then it didn't get made?
Oh, so many. Must have been at least a dozen, probably more, maybe 24. I don't know. It's like a lot, like a lot. And I do remember them because I hold a candle for all my failed pitches. I still I feel like I should have a little mini graveyard for my pitches. But and still many. I strike out more often than I hit and get on base. But and what was the second part of that question? Was like, is there a particular story that that has failed? And I think like one funny one that I remember that I said on that first phone call with that executive producer at Radiolab was I got really interested in, I guess there are certain, I don't even know if this is true anymore. This is true like 15 years ago. There were a lot of mathematicians who were really into knitting, and they knit like abstract geometric forms, I guess, and try to understand what they're doing through knitting. So I was like, oh, like mathematical knitting. And I remember her being like, her name's Ellen Horn, and she was like, that's like, you couldn't have engineered a story that would be worse for audio. Like the sound of knitting is the most boring thing I can imagine. Like there's no way we're going to do that story. But yeah, and a lot of that was like me kind of like learning the form, and I still feel like I'm learning the form. I still, a lot of my pitches flop all the time. Yeah, but anyway, rejection is very, very strongly a part of the, a part of the process, a part of the game.
Thank you.
Hi, so I'm gonna relay an anonymous question, and since it's anonymous, I'm gonna take the liberty of adding a little to it of my own.
Okay, great.
But so the question is about academics and the ways that they can oftentimes sound a bit dry. The anonymous attendee says, I genuinely mean no offense to the academics in here.
Sure.
So none taken. The question is, how do you make them sound not dry to your average real life listener? And I just want to add, so sort of, it's something that in my own podcast, How to Read, I'm constantly trying to think about. And as a team, we do things like we come up with the most ridiculous possible question to ask a scholar. And see if that gets a less dry response. We also kind of pre-plan jokes to try and kind of throw them off a little bit. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, so right. How do you make scholars sound less dry to the average listener?
Yeah, that's part of it. Okay, there's like several off the top of my head techniques for that. One is kind of casting. Like for any given topic, they're usually, a couple of experts who you could talk to. And it's like doing pre-interviews with a lot of them. Either I would do or a producer would do or something like that just before, just get a quick, just talk to them a little bit, not too much, just to get a sense of their flair, how they talk, what they, and that's helpful also, like before an interview to be like, are you nervous about anything? Or is there anything you hesitate to talk about or you don't want to, just having that conversation ahead of time. In two ways. One, you can suss out how they are as a talker in a way, but also two, that when you do the interview, if we've already said ahead of time, oh, I really don't want to talk about, I don't want to get into that. Then you know that ahead of time. And then you like, if there's a bumper there, they feel a lot more comfortable. And so they'll open up a lot more. Another thing is that when you are talking, we do at Radiolab, we have, again, luxury of doing super long interviews. So we do super long interviews. And the interviews that are super long, the kind of good thing about that is let the person warm up, let them get comfortable. Like this is not something they always do. So let them kind of, and at some point, if you're doing it right, sort of the microphone or the Zoom screen or whatever it is, however you're interviewing them, it just sort of fades away and you're just talking. You're just two people talking. And that is where you get much better stuff. And also another thing is often at the beginning of the call, I think a lot of experts often, they have in their head prepared like what they're going to say. Like they're like, I want to say this, I want to say this, I want to say this. And then they kind of rehearse it ahead of time. And then it like, and when something comes out and it feels canned in a way. And so just let that person say that. And sometimes that's helpful. And sometimes you'll use that, but a lot of times not. And so just let them say that. And once that is sort of off their chest and they feel like, oh, that's been said, now I can have an actual conversation, but I just needed to get that off my chest. So that's another helpful thing. And Milan, the thing that you said, that's also true. Like a lot of times this is stuff people have talked about 100 times. Like find a way to throw them off. Ask them a weird question that they've never gotten before, that they actually have to think. And when people are thinking in real time and talking, that tape is inevitably better than if they're just saying a thing they've said 100 times and they know to be true. So it's a combo of all those things and many more and you can really draw out kind of more more like vibrant, and these people, they're actually like that in real life. But it's just when you get them talking about a very specific, field of expertise where, and there's a lot riding on it. They don't want their colleagues to think this or that. So it's like, if you get all of that, I feel like then you can get to a place where it's like a more human place.
Great. So thank you so much for being here. We also have a question from Mac, who says, you've touched on aspects of this, but I'd love to hear a quick breakdown of a Radio Lab episode production from the initial pitch to dropping in the feed. So a little bit more about process and production there.
Definitely. Yeah. So basically it starts with a kind of basically a pitch. And the pitch is about a page long, and it basically is like, okay, here's the story, and the story how you would hear it in the episode, basically. Excuse me. Here's the kind of big idea or argument or question that is sort of at the heart of this story. And then the end is like, here's the access, like, here's who I want to talk to, and they've agreed to talk, and they're the person, ideally it's the person at the very center of the story. And so that's the pitch. It goes in front of the whole team, and the team kind of choose it over, and they're like, oh, didn't somebody else do something very similar to this? Or, oh, I've heard this story before. Or, oh, this is so interesting. I never even thought about this from the perspective of the da-da-da. So ultimately, like the editorial team picks, some of those to run at. We kind of circle up, figure out what are the questions we need, what's the tape we need to get, what are the questions we have to answer before we're really committed to this thing. Kind of there's a kind of a lather, rinse, repeat of go out, report, get a few things, come back, report back. Oh, did we get the things we want? Oh, but that just makes me ask another question. So then go out and go get that thing and do that a number of times until we're sort of ready. We're like, oh, now we have enough. Like now this feels like a big enough pile of stuff that we could make an episode out of this. Then we do basically storyboarding. And sometimes also mood boarding. So it's like, okay, what is the plot? What is the order? We'll do this. We'll use this tape over here, this tape over here, this tape over here. We also do, I neglected to say, we do a bunch of interviews. And then we select out we reduce them down. So like if I'm doing 90-minute or more interviews, like we'd reduce them down to 15 minutes or so, each of them. And we listen to all of those right before we go into the storyboard meeting. So the storyboard meeting is basically lining it out in terms of plot, like, okay, what goes here, what's before the break, what's the thing that we're going to say that will make people come back from the break, and what's the landing place that will feel like this story, really comes together, and this is the reason why we're saying it. Anyway, all of that. There's also a mood board, which is like more of a meeting of like, what do we want this to sound like? Like, what movie is this? Like, is this like a heist movie? Like, okay, so then like, even if it's not a heist movie, we can make it feel like a heist movie. There's that. And then basically, then it's just making drafts and drafts and drafts and iterations. Like we carry out that thing. You're like, oh, actually, no, it shouldn't be making this a heist movie feels real icky and weird. Let's try a totally different thing. So we do that. There's, dozens of drafts. And then ultimately at some point there's fact checking, there's scoring, there is, a bunch of other social media people and web copy and all that kind of stuff. And then, and then the thing hits publish, usually in like the middle of the night. And that's kind of the process from soup to nuts.
That's great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to jump in and ask Rochelle Wilson's question, which I think is great. And I am biased because she's currently working at the magazine that I used to work at, Edufex at University of Wisconsin. But so Rochelle asks, do you think podcast production teams are still open to hiring humanities PhDs, like what happened to you? Or is the industry professionalizing in a way that prefers journalism J-school applicants?
That is a really good question. I do think what happened to me was a very weird one-off kind of a thing, but that's not to say that the door is closed. I do think that it is, well, first of all, there are a lot more jobs than when I got into the game. There's just so many more kinds of podcasts. There's so many more there's so many more roles. Like even like there are people who are professional full-time fact checkers for podcasts, or like professional full-time fact checkers for science podcasts, or it just has gotten very, very niche and specific. So there are a lot more jobs because there are a lot more shows. But also there's a lot more people who now want to do this. And so there's a lot more competition. And I do think, I don't think there's necessarily a bias for journalists per se. I do think that there is a bias for expertise. So experience with, sound editing, like Pro Tools or Hindenburg or whatever the things are that you're using. There's also, a bias for like, oh, I know how to use a mic. I know, like that kind of thing. I do think that there is at a time when, when there are a lot of jobs, like people are like, oh, but just prove to me you've done this like once before, that said, I do think like I came into this field with zero audio production experience, zero journalism experience, which tells you sort of how long ago it was. But to me, the thing that really, really is the value that humanities folks have and can bring to bear is kind of an original perspective and access to things that are often not easily Googleable, to be able to kind of synthesize a lot of information, come with stories that are not everywhere already, to be able to kind of offer a fresh perspective. I think that's really valuable. And that's the thing I would lead with, to be like, look, yeah, you could get, somebody else who is good at reporting, the news that, and is good in the press scrum where you have 20 other reporters, or you could hire me and I'm by myself in the archive, looking at stuff that nobody else has looked at. And so I think you can say more original things, and not, I mean, the archive is a analogy, but whatever your, version of the archive is, I think it's like, look, I have original stuff to contribute here. And often a lot of outlets, because that's what they want. They don't want to be saying the same thing as everybody else. They want something different. That there is also a good value to that.
So I'll jump in with another question from the chat. This one is from Uli Bear, another of the founding members of this network. Do you have a favorite episode you've worked on and why? That might be a big question, but
oh man,
what comes to mind
of Radiolab in particular? Yeah. Let me think. God, there's so many. We just reran one that I love. Like last week or 2 weeks ago, which was this episode about this guy named Oliver Sipple, who was a Marine who he kind of saves the president, at the time, President Ford's life. He like deflects a bullet. A woman is trying to shoot the president. He deflects the bullet. But then in the aftermath of that, he becomes this hero. He's on the news. He gets outed as gay, and it basically destroys his life. So saving the president's life destroys his own life. His family won't talk to him. He dies a miserable, alone, lonely death. And to me, that was a very powerful and kind of ethically fraught, interesting story. But one of the things that I was really proud that I and my co-reporter, Tracy Hunt, that we were able to do on that story was go to the archive. First of all, this was a story that not a lot of people have told before. And then we were able to go to the archive and we were able to find like original footage of the press conference where this guy was like you can hear him trembling, stuttering his way through this press conference to say, like, my sexual orientation has nothing to do with the fact that I saved the president's life. Stop talking about the fact that I'm gay. And to be able to hear that, it's like, I found it so powerful and so meaningful. And it was one of those things where I was like, oh, I think my PhD training my archival research training like really helped me to do that. To get that tape that nobody else, I don't think anybody had heard since 1970 something. And yeah, and that, I don't know. So it was just a recent one, but that one really sticks with me, and I'm very proud of that episode.
I'm just going to jump in here and say that that Uli was very generous and gave you the positive version of that, because I was going to ask the negative version. I was going to end with the spectacular failure, but I think you're spared that question. Unless you have a spectacular failure.
Yeah, let me think of a great spectacular failure. I mean, I have most of them sort of die before they get on air, so I'm sort of spared the public humiliation of it. But I have many spectacular failures. Let me think of a good one. Let me see. I spent much of 2020 reporting a story that I thought was this incredible story about vaccines and the 1970, whatever it was, swine flu epidemic and the vaccine development. And it was a big boondoggle. I spent so much time researching with my fellow reporter Sarakari, and it was a complete flop. It must have been, I don't know, 6 months into reporting where I did a key interview with a very high level. It was the Secretary of Health under President Ford. And I posed him this question that I thought was this hardball question, and he just laughed it off. And he's like, no, it was totally fine. I would do it again. And it was a thing where I was like, there's no story here. I don't know what.
Really? Because it's the last chapter of Michael Lewis's book. I actually thought it.
Oh, is it really? Oh, I need to read that. I need to read that. He is a more gifted alchemist than I am.
No. I don't think I'm sure it's not that. I mean, you're an alchemist, but he thinks there is a story there. But
okay,
it's interesting. There's some dangling threads in that chapter. So
okay,
I want to hear.
Maybe I can salvage my spectacular failure then.
Yeah. So Latif, this has been great. And the main thanks go to you, but I definitely want to thank Uli and Molly at the NYU Center for putting together this particular webinar. And as we've all seen, Rebecca and Candace, the interpreters. So thank you, the ASL interpreters. Thank you so much to those guys.
Thank you so much. I hope I didn't speak too fast for you.
They seem incredibly good. So yeah. And I think, we should wrap up now because we've got other panels going on, but with big thanks, and thanks to Kayla as well, who's another secret person behind the scenes. But from all of us at the network, thank you so much, Latif. It's really generous of you to come and take the time. And
thank you all who are involved in doing this, and I'm really rooting for this network. So good luck.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So bye-bye for now.
Bye.